Mr. Rita has asked me to thank you for your time, and he expressed his regret in not being able to be here with us today. Unfortunately, Mr. Rita was required to report to the Bureau of Prisons on July 2nd, 2007 to begin the service of his sentence. Ironically, this was the same day that President Bush commuted the 30-month prison term of I. Lewis Libby, concluding that his sentence was excessive. It's highly appropriate for you to examine the legal background of Mr. Rita's case and Mr. Libby's case. I believe you will be surprised to find they are nearly identical in many aspects. To begin, you'll be surprised to find that neither man was truly the target of the investigation for which he ultimately was charged. In North Carolina, Assistant U.S. Attorney Matthew Martins began an investigation of a North Carolina firearms company, Interordinance, to determine whether it was violating the federal firearms laws. In the process of this investigation, Mr. Martins called witnesses, including Mr. Rita, before the grand jury. Here in Washington, U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald was appointed to investigate the leaking of Valerie Plame's name to columnist Robert Novak to learn whether any person violated either the Intelligence Identities Protection Act or the Espionage Act. In the process of this investigation, Mr. Fitzgerald called witnesses, including Mr. Libby, before the grand jury to testify. Both men, Rita and Libby, were federally indicted on counts of making false statements under oath, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Both were convicted by a jury. Both men were sentenced to over 2 years of imprisonment, Mr. Rita for 33 months and Mr. Libby for 30 months. Both men have extensive civil service backgrounds, are dedicated family men, and have been subjected to a harsh sentence based in part on allegations never presented to the jury. Despite all of these similarities, today Mr. Rita is in prison and Mr. Libby is not. I had no involvement in the Libby case and therefore cannot comment upon the details of what transpired other than what I have gleaned from documents retrieved from the district court file. Having represented Mr. Rita, however, I can give you a better explanation of his case and background. Mr. Rita is a 59-year-old man who spent the better part of his life in public service. Like Mr. Libby, who has received various awards for his service, Mr. Rita has accumulated over 35 medals, awards, and commendations for his military service. All told, Mr. Rita retired with more than 32 years of service to the federal government. Like Mr. Libby, whose attorneys described him in their sentencing memorandum as a dedicated family man, Mr. Rita is also devoted to his family. He describes himself as a family man, having helped raise his 2 sons. Despite these similarities, Mr. Rita's personal background is very different from Mr. Libby's in many respects. While Mr. Libby is a law school graduate, Mr. Rita had a troubled youth and had to grow up partly on his own. He dropped out of high school. He did obtain his GED and later completed an Associate of Arts degree while working for then the INS. As a result, Mr. Rita is not of the same means as Mr. Libby. Though he retained his own attorney in the district court, he went into debt and exhausted all of his funds during that trial. His pro se notice of appeal he filed himself and was appointed counsel for the appellate process. In comparison, Mr. Libby had the benefit of his own legal training, a large defense team, and the Libby Legal Defense Trust, which was formed to help defray the legal costs for his defense. In addition to his severely strained economic condition, Mr. Rita also differs from Mr. Libby with regard to his health. Mr. Rita suffers from hypertension, degenerative disc disease, type 2 diabetes, an enlarged prostate, infection in his legs, and a skin rash due to the exposure of Agent Orange while he was a foot soldier in Vietnam. There are suspicions some of his illnesses originated from the exposure of Agent Orange. He takes well over a dozen medications per day and requires a CPAP machine to sleep at night. Now I'd like to address some of the parts of the decision in the Supreme Court case. Leading to that, Mr. Rita appeared before the grand jury in North Carolina and gave answers that were contrary to his actions. Those answers provided the basis for charges of false testimony and obstruction. He was indicted on these charges. With regard to Mr. Libby's case, please note that his 5 counts of obstruction and false statement and perjury revolve around 3 conversations that he had. Mr. Rita was only brought before the grand jury once, Mr. Libby 4 times. Mr. Rita went to trial and was convicted on all 5 counts. His trial counsel filed a motion for a reduced sentence. At sentencing, counsel presented evidence and Mr. Rita was sentenced to 33 months. Mr. Libby also went to trial and was convicted of 4 of the 5 charges against him. he filed sentencing memoranda requesting a sentence of probation. The court sentenced him to 30 months, 2 years of supervision, and a $250,000 fine. On July 2nd, President Bush commuted Mr. Libby's 30-month sentence.
Could you wind up, sir?
I would be happy, Mr. Chairman. Incredibly, the President's justification for commuting Mr. Libby's sentence mirror Mr. Rita's arguments before the Supreme Court. However, when Mr. Rita appeared before the court this past February, the President's Solicitor General took the opposite position and argued that uniformity in sentencing trumped Mr. Rita's justification. The President's actions placed his absolute constitutional pardoning power at odds with his own Solicitor General's successful argument before the Supreme Court. I spoke by telephone with Mr. Rita this past Monday. He had one question that he asked that I posed to this committee. How can the executive branch argue that my reasons for seeking a lower sentence before the Supreme Court were wrong, and then use my same reasons for a lower sentence to justify wiping out Mr. Libby's prison time completely? I would like to thank you for your time, and I would be happy to answer whatever questions I can.
I thank the witness.